Louis XIV. They called him the only king in Europe, for his aim was to have no rivals. Louis XIV was the epitome of a king who lived in a beautiful palace surrounded by things which gave him pleasure. He even chose the dramatic emblem of the sun for himself, as he thought it was the brightest, most beautiful image of a great king. Ambassadors to the court at Versailles described Louis XIV as a tall, impressive man, 1.8 metres high. In his portraits he does not appear attractive to the modern eye, as he looks proud and haughty, with a fleshy face and a large nose. His height was achieved by shoes with red high heels. As written accounts tell us that he was handsome and gracious, there was clearly something striking about Louis that could not be captured on canvas. Today we would call it charisma. Women found him both dignified and charming. Stories abounded at court that people would make fools of themselves in order to catch a glimpse of his majesty. A special aura surrounded Louis. From a very early age he attracted attention. He was clear-headed and determined in pursuing his goals. Blessed with excellent health, he delighted in physical exercise. He was extremely robust and had to face the challenges he would meet on the throne. As a child, Louis was taught that he would be powerful and glorious. He was 5 years old in 1643 when his father died, and his mother, Anne of Austria, became regent. In fact, the power behind the throne lay with Cardinal Mazarin. He had followed Cardinal de Richelieu, who had run the country when Louis's father was on the throne. Despite many attempts to get rid of Mazarin, the cardinal managed to hold on to power. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis realized that he could hold the reins of power himself. Unlike his father, he had no intention of allowing ministers to do his job. He summoned them early one morning to make an important announcement. Although he had no experience of government, he would not be a puppet king, he said, but he would rule France himself. After that day, he wrote in his memoirs, "I knew then that I was king and born for it. I experienced an indescribable delight." Louis's character became inseparable from his role as king. His ministers served him faithfully, none more so than Jean-Baptiste Colbert, whose job it was to provide Louis with money for his wars, his buildings, his lavish entertainments, and his generous gifts to his mistresses and friends. Louis married Marie-Thérèse, the daughter of the King of Spain, in 1660. They had a son, the heir to the throne, called the Dauphin. But being a husband and father did not curb Louis's high spending. In 1663, Colbert complained about his extravagance. Although Louis grumbled, Colbert cut the cost of court entertaining. For Louis, lavish parties and gorgeous clothes were included in his idea of glory. The French economy did improve with Colbert's work. The middle classes became more prosperous, but the peasants noticed little change. The king's coffers were too empty to help the poor of Paris. As a rule, Louis's ministers were not members of the old landed nobility. Men who were already rich and powerful might be a threat. Men such as the Prince du Condé, who spent 10 years fighting against France on the Spanish side. Condé was allowed to resume his brilliant career as a general of France and even became the governor of Burgundy. To make sure no French nobleman or foreign prince could rival him, Louis made his court the most brilliant and magnificent in Europe. The fantastic palace and garden of Versailles were only part of the attraction. Molière and Racine, the two greatest playwrights of the age, had their plays performed there. Elaborate stage machinery was used for drama and numerous ballets, under the direction of the composer Lully. The king's musicians became the finest in the country. The Queen died in 1683, but Louis had always enjoyed female company at court. He had a series of mistresses, but few held his attention for long. Only 3 women managed this: Louise de la Vallière, Madame de Montepassin, who bore him 7 children, and Madame de Maneton, the serious and very religious companion of his old age. Louis may have secretly married Madame de la Maneton after the Queen's death. Court gossips never knew if the rumour were true or not. Louis liked to keep people guessing, according to the situation. He could be friendly and witty or cold and reserved, but almost always disguised his true feelings. In his youth, Louis lived life to the full. He enjoyed dancing, hunting, shooting, royal tennis, music. He was a good guitarist and good company. but Louis never let his pleasures interfere with the serious business of running the country. After the ceremonies of getting up and dressing, attended by the privileged members of the court, he went to mass, then sat with his ministers until lunch. The afternoon was usually spent hunting a stag, a wild boar, or one of the last wolves in the area, or walking in his gardens. Then, if necessary, he might summon another council. At least twice a week, he felt it his duty to provide an evening's entertainment for the court with dancing, feasting, and gambling. Louis's energy was inexhaustible. Even as an old man, he kept to a similar routine, although now he visited the garden in a chariot, a kind of chair on wheels pushed by 4 soldiers, hunted in an open carriage rather than on horseback, and his favourite game was billiards. Although France was at war for much of his reign, Louis never led his troops into battle. He did not need to, as he had the finest generals of his time. He constantly engaged his country in aggressive warfare, often travelling to the front to review troops or to watch the progress of a siege. During the summer months, Versailles was more often like a barracks than a palace. When Louis needed more men, troops working on the chateau were sent to battle. The aim of many military campaigns was to secure the borders of France with the Netherlands and the Holy Roman Empire. He was humiliated when the Dutch opened the sea dikes to let the sea in and flooded their country to prevent his army advancing. But for most of his rule, his policies were successful. In the peace treaties after his wars, whether they were against the Dutch, the English, the Austrians, or the Spanish, Louis usually achieved what he wanted. Another important part of his policy was arranging marriages to benefit the royal house of France. But when, in 1700, one of Louis's grandsons became Philip V of Spain, the rest of Europe decided that his power and influence had become too great. This sparked off the disastrous war of the Spanish Succession. Even though France was not totally defeated, the cost to the country in lives and money was enormous. Louis became more serious later in life, and his once flamboyant lifestyle became sober. His plans for the succession to the throne were ruined. His eldest son died in 1711, and further deaths followed. Louis said, "There are few examples of such disasters as have befallen me as the loss of a grandson, a granddaughter-in-law, and their son, all of great promise and most dearly loved. God is punishing me." The Sun King was not immortal. When Louis died in 1715, he was succeeded by his 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV. The struggle over who should rule France was about to begin again.